I'm Alex Rondinan, and welcome to If History is Any Guide, the political and current affairs program on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. Kashmir's leading political figure and voice of conscience was Sheikh Abdullah, a, quote, talented and clever nationalist leader, end quote, who spent his entire public career fighting for his people's independence. He had participated in the wave of protests in the 1930s, which gave birth to the modern Kashmiri independence movement. Quote, in April 1931, the police entered the mosque in Jammu and stopped the Friday Ketubah, which follows prayers. The police chief claimed that references in the Quran to Moses and Pharaoh quoted by the preacher were tantamount to sedition. It was an exceptionally stupid thing to do, and inevitably it triggered a new wave of protests. In June, the largest political rally ever seen in Srinagar elected 11 representatives by popular acclamation to lead the struggle against native and colonial repression. Abdul Qadir, a butler who worked for a European household, was arrested for having described the Dogra rulers as a dynasty of bloodsuckers who had drained the energies and resources of all our people. On the first day of Qadir's trial, thousands of demonstrators gathered outside the prison and demanded the right to attend the proceedings. The police opened fire, killing 21 of them. Sheikh Abdullah and other political leaders were arrested the following day, and this was the founding moment of Kashmiri nationalism, end quote. It was during this period that Abdullah developed a strong relationship with Nehru, because the two shared a very similar world outlook and had a similar hatred for suffering and injustice. Nehru, as per his left-wing principles, made innumerable public statements which clearly articulated his support for the concept of Kashmiri independence. Because of his astute reasoning and moral ideals, Nehru knew that the British Empire and its feudal quislings were the key fetters to social progress. Only through radical actions, kicking out the colonialists and achieving self-government, could serious social reforms be introduced, which would result in improving the well-being for the majority of hitherto suffering and miserable Kashmiris. Abdullah, despite being a Quranic scholar, was a committed secularist. This allowed him to see past the irrationality of communalism and to view clearly the real political battles that were afoot. Unsurprisingly then, he was disgusted by the behaviour of Jinnah, with the concept that Islam could be the founding basis for a nation's existence. Even if Kashmir had a Muslim majority population, this had nothing to do with questions of statehood, government, economics and policies. Furthermore, quote, he regarded the Muslim League as a reactionary organisation and rightly feared that if Kashmir became part of Pakistan, the Punjabi landlords who dominated the Muslim League would stand in the way of any social or political reforms, end quote. When independence came, the decision had to be made as to which side of the partition line Kashmir would lay. Abdullah, because of his role and status as a Kashmiri national leader, had effectively an executive discretion on which side it would be. He refused to join his fellow South Asian Muslims in Pakistan and instead selected majority Hindu India, quote, provided the Kashmiris were allowed to determine their own future, end quote. Quote, at a mass rally in Srinagar, Nehru, with Abdullah at his side, publicly promised as much. In November, Abdullah was appointed Prime Minister of an emergency administration, end quote. In the first years after India became independent, the promised plebiscite on the future status of Kashmir had to be postponed because of the chaotic events following the 1947-48 war between India and Pakistan. The unnoticed at the time, but highly consequential problem was that, once the fighting had stopped, the reality of Kashmir being a part of India had become a fait accompli, and so Indian politicians began regarding the territories as genuine parts of the Union. These were the ideological roots of Indian chauvinism, where political elites refused to accept any independence or autonomy for Kashmir, fighting to the last bullet to keep it within India. During his tenure in power, Abdullah implemented a radical agrarian reform program, which destroyed the power of the landlords and provided much needed land for the small peasantry. He also built schools and hospitals and even a university. A few years later, when the time became ripe for holding the referendum, Nehru reneged on his earlier position, from then on preferring Kashmir to remain part of India for the foreseeable future. Quote, when the Indian Prime Minister visited Srinagar in May 1953, he spent a week trying to cajole his friend into accepting a permanent settlement on Delhi's terms. End quote. When it became clear that Abdullah wasn't going to yield, the Nehru administration launched a military assault, dismissing the incumbent government and installing a quisling suzerain. The Prime Minister had turned against his old friend and was committing horrific crimes against the Kashmiri people in order to appease the chauvinists in his own party and government. The Kashmiri people rose up in response to this, launching a general strike. The fighting lasted for 20 days and involved intense battles against Indian troops. With thousands of people killed, Sheikh Abdullah was arrested without trial for 4 years, which was enough time for the Indian occupation to neutralize the local opposition and stabilize its hold over the territory. When he was briefly released, Abdullah tried to agitate amongst the Kashmiri masses in Srinagar against this betrayal of Nehru's and India's, before then being arrested again. Thanks to the quisling suzerain regime in place, a new constitution was created for India-controlled Jammu and Kashmir regions, which explicitly stated that these territories were an, quote, integral part of the Union of India, end quote. It was made clear by the quisling leadership that the eventual goal was for Kashmir to be fully integrated into India, being a state or province no different from the rest of the country. The constitutional change was the first step towards eventual full annexation. Nehru then switched his position again. The changes were dropped and Abdullah was let out of prison. The two met in Delhi to conduct the opening stages of talks towards eventually reaching a negotiated settlement. Abdullah also had dialogues with Ayub Khan in mid-1964, and it seemed that the Pakistani president was beginning to feel rather accommodating towards the notion of holding a Kashmiri plebiscite, which would, presumably, also include the small section of Pakistan-controlled Kashmiri territory. But just when serious diplomatic progress was being made, Nehru died. The Congress Party and the Indian central government fell into the hands of pragmatists, chauvinists, and faceless bureaucrats. No one was willing to continue with Nehru's renewed support for Kashmiri independence, ipso facto destroying the negotiations. Lal Bahadur Shastri, the new Indian Prime Minister, who was made from completely different material to that of Nehru, was cold regarding the negotiations and didn't allow them to continue. Abdullah realized that the Indian government would only concede to continuing the negotiations if serious outside pressure was brought upon them. He spent the next few months, quote, traveling around the world, trying to get international support, and was received in several capitals with the honours accorded to visiting heads of state, end quote. Quote, in the course of his travels, Sheikh Abdullah made some noteworthy statements relating to the aspirations of the Kashmiri people and also highly critical of the Indian government, end quote. When he returned back home, quote, Abdullah was imprisoned again. This time he and his wife were sent to prisons far away from Kashmir. The response was the usual: strikes, demonstrations, arrests, and a few deaths. A sentiment started to emerge amongst politically conscious Kashmiris that the only course of action available to them in order to escape the brutal and authoritarian Indian occupation was for them to get assistance from Pakistan. As the year 1965 started, the situation inside occupied Kashmir was one of ebb in the indigenous struggle, but there was still immense anger over the events that had just occurred. The seething frustrations were simmering, and any new injustice would surely return the situation to the point of boiling. The situation could be best described as a powder keg, suffocating with tension as Indian soldiers tried to restrain and pacify the restless civilian population. The underground task of the Kashmiri revolutionaries was to use this time to properly prepare, both militarily, organizationally, and politically, for that future resumption of mass struggle for freedom for Kashmir. And that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to If History is Any Guide, the political and current affairs program on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm Alex Rondinan. Until next time, goodbye.